A piece of wire changed where 30 million cattle are allowed to stand in this country. Not a tractor, not a tractor-trailer, not a satellite. A strand of twisted wire with 2 spikes on it, invented by a farmer in Illinois. Within 10 years, it ended a 250-year-old way of life and rewired the entire American West. These are 10 inventions that transformed America's cattle industry. One ends the cowboy era in a single decade. Another lets a single bull father thousands of calves he never met the mothers of, and one happening right now, on ranches in Nebraska as we speak, is doing to barbed wire what barbed wire did to the open range. Welcome to Cattle County. Today, cattle and beef bring more than $100 billion into the US economy every single year. But for most of American history, it was just a few million wild Spanish cattle wandering Texas brushland that nobody wanted because there was no way to get them anywhere that mattered. So how did we get from a $30 million regional struggle to a $100 billion global powerhouse? 10 specific inventions did it. And to understand how we got there, we have to start with the moment the American West stopped being a wilderness and started becoming a factory. Number 10. The railroad. In 1865, the American cattle industry was a zombie economy. In Texas, there were roughly 5 or 6 million head of Longhorn cattle wandering the brush. Because of the Civil War, they had bred uncontrollably. They were everywhere, but they were worth almost nothing. In Texas, a cow was worth maybe $3 to $4. There were too many cows and not enough people to eat them. Meanwhile, in the industrializing cities of the East, like New York, Philadelphia, and Boston, hungry factory workers were desperate for beef. In those cities, that same $3 Texas cow was worth $40 to $50. This massive price gap was the industry's great disconnect. The only way to get the cattle from Texas to New York was a 1,500-mile walk. By the time the cattle reached the East on foot, they were exhausted, tough, and often dying of disease. The industry was stuck because it couldn't solve the distance problem. The innovation wasn't just the train, it was the railhead. In 1867, an entrepreneur named Joseph McCoy realized that if he could build a meeting point where the cattle trails from the south hit the railroad tracks from the east, he could bridge the gap. He chose a tiny, muddy stop called Abilene, Kansas, and built a hotel, a bank, and massive loading pens. For the first time, ranchers didn't have to walk their cattle all the way to the East Coast. They only had to walk them to Kansas. This created the era of the long drive. Cowboys would push herds north from Texas to these Kansas cow towns, where the cattle were driven up wooden ramps into specialized wooden cars. Transportation shifted from animal muscle to steam power. The railroad fundamentally altered the industry. Almost overnight, the value of a Texas cow jumped from $3 to $30 or $40 because it now had access to the East Coast market. This massive influx of cash funded the expansion of legendary ranches. Beef became a national commodity rather than a local luxury. A cow from the Texas Panhandle could now feed a family in Chicago. Without the railroad, none of this exists. But a train can only move a live animal, and a live animal is mostly stuff nobody wants to eat. The next problem wasn't getting cattle to the city. It was figuring out what to do with them once they got there. Innovation number 9. The disassembly line. In the mid-1800s, the modern meat industry didn't exist, only the local butcher trade. If you lived in a city and wanted beef, you went to a butcher who processed a live animal by hand. This artisanal era was slow, messy, and highly inefficient. The biggest problem was waste. A single butcher couldn't do much with the extras, so while the hide and meat were sold, the bones, blood, and organs were often wasted. Because butchers had to cover their costs using only the prime cuts, beef remained a luxury. In the 1870s, in the Union stockyards of Chicago, entrepreneurs like Gustavus Swift and Philip Armour realized they needed a factory system. They took the concept of a production line and flipped it. Instead of putting a product together, they systematically disassembled it. They built massive multi-story plants where gravity did the work. An animal was hoisted onto an overhead trolley system. As the carcass traveled along the rail, it passed a series of specialized workers. One worker did nothing but remove the hide, another split the carcass, and a third trimmed the meat. By the time the carcass reached the end, it had been processed in a fraction of the time. Decades later, Henry Ford would visit these plants and credit them as the inspiration for his automotive assembly line. The disassembly line changed the economics of ranching by allowing plants to process thousands of cattle a day, creating a constant demand. By specializing labor, processing costs dropped, making beef an affordable staple for the working class. These meat packers also utilized the waste, turning fat into soap, hooves into glue, and bones into fertilizer. They famously bragged they used everything but the squeal, turning side businesses into highly profitable operations. Here's the irony. The faster they got at taking a cow apart, the worse their next problem became. Meat doesn't wait. You could carve up 1,000 cattle in Chicago by lunchtime, and every single pound of it was rotting before it reached Boston. Innovation number 8. The refrigerated railcar. In the 1870s, shipping a live 1,000-pound steer to the east was an economic nightmare. First, there was shrink animals lost up to 10% of their body weight through stress and dehydration during the long ride. Second, ranchers paid to transport the entire animal, even though hundreds of pounds of it was waste that would be discarded at the destination. The industry paid a massive premium to move parts people didn't eat. The obvious solution was to slaughter the cattle in Chicago and ship only the meat, but fresh beef would spoil before crossing state lines. Then Gustavus Swift realized that solving this biological barrier would secure control of the food supply. In 1877, Swift's engineer, Andrew Chase, designed a practical refrigerated car. The car used bunkers at each end filled with ice and salt to lower the temperature. Crucially, it was designed so that as the train moved, air was forced over the ice, cooled, and circulated around the meat hanging from the ceiling. Though railroads resisted the technology to protect their investment in cattle cars, Swift bypassed them by building his own fleet 200 refrigerated cars. The impact was massive. It shifted the geography of the industry, centralizing meatpacking in the Midwest, while the West became the ranch, and the East became the consumer. Swift cut transportation costs by half, allowing him to sell Chicago beef in New York for less than local beef. It also established year-round consumption. Instead of slaughtering only in winter, beef became a consistent staple, 365 days a year. Refrigeration solved the clock. It didn't solve the map. All these cattle still needed somewhere to graze, and on the Great Plains, there were no trees, no stone, no natural way to mark whose land was whose. The next fight wasn't over meat. It was over land. Innovation number 7. Barbed wire. Before 1874, the American West was one giant unfenced pasture. While romanticized as the open range, it was a business nightmare. Because cattle from different ranches grazed together, genetic control was nearly impossible. Expensive bulls mated randomly with low-quality cows. Water was also a constant source of conflict, sparking bitter range wars over access to streams. Furthermore, tracking cattle required hiring an army of cowboys for costly annual roundups. In 1874, Joseph Glidden, a farmer in Illinois, twisted 2 wires together to trap short, sharp spikes of wire in the middle, creating barbed wire. It was marketed as lighter than air, stronger than whiskey, and cheaper than dust. It was the first fencing material cheap enough to enclose thousands of acres of treeless prairie. Ranchers adopted it rapidly, and by 1880, factories were producing 80 million pounds of wire annually, slicing the West into private property. Barbed wire replaced an entire way of life with an industrial system. It brought an end to the historic long drives and the classic cowboy era within a single decade. Fences allowed ranchers to control breeding, raising the overall quality of American beef. However, the technology had a dark side. In the brutal winter of 1886, massive blizzards swept the plains, and hundreds of thousands of drifting cattle piled up against the new wire fences, freezing to death in an event known as the Big Die-Up. Barbed wire solved geography. It did nothing for genetics. A rancher could now fence in 1,000 acres, but he still had to physically own, feed, ship, and risk the life of an expensive bull just to improve his herd one mating at a time. Innovation number 6. Artificial insemination. In the early 1900s, managing bulls was a high-stakes gamble. These 2,000-pound animals were dangerous, frequently injuring workers and damaging property. They were also disease vectors. A single bull with a reproductive infection could spread it to an entire herd, wiping out a rancher's calf crop. Furthermore, acquiring elite genetics was difficult and expensive, requiring ranchers to ship heavy bulls across the country and hope they survived the journey. The breakthrough came in 1949 when researchers discovered that adding glycerol allowed bull semen to be frozen without damaging the cells. By the mid-1950s, the industry adopted liquid nitrogen storage at -320 degrees Fahrenheit. This turned a biological asset into a transportable resource. A single collection from an elite bull could be diluted, frozen into small straws, and stored in vacuum-sealed tanks for decades. Ranchers no longer needed to own a bull. They could store genetics in a nitrogen tank and have them delivered anywhere. It bypassed traditional biological limits. While a bull on the open range might sire 30 calves a year, the most prolific recorded sires using frozen genetics have fathered well over 100,000 calves they never met. This massive genetic scaling helped standardize the American herd, leading to the widespread rise of highly consistent breeds like Black Angus. It allowed small-scale operations to access premium genetics affordably, raising the quality of everyday beef. But better genetics didn't matter much if the calf died of pneumonia at 6 weeks old. The industry had built a genetic superhighway straight into a herd with almost no immune defenses. Innovation number 5. Antibiotics and modern vaccines. Before the 1940s, cattle operations faced a persistent threat from pathogens. Without effective treatments, a single sick calf could spread illness through a herd in days. This risk capped herd density, keeping operations small to prevent respiratory diseases like shipping fever from spreading. It also made long-term planning difficult and kept financial institutions hesitant to lend capital to such high-risk businesses. The mid-20th century brought a medical revolution to the ranch, starting with the mass production of penicillin and tetracycline. Chemical solutions turned bacterial infections from fatal diagnoses into manageable issues. Simultaneously, developers introduced modern vaccines that primed a calf's immune system against respiratory and reproductive diseases before they ever hit the ranch. The industry also began utilizing subtherapeutic antibiotics in feed to prevent sickness before it started. This biological shield allowed thousands of animals to be managed in close proximity, removing the density ceiling and making production far more predictable. As mortality rates fell, financial risk decreased, attracting significant capital to help the industry modernize and expand into international markets. If this kind of cattle history breakdown is your thing, hit the like and subscribe button for more. Disease was no longer the ceiling. Density was no longer the ceiling. So what was? Time. Raised purely on grass, it still took an animal 3 to 4 years to reach market weight, and nobody had figured out how to speed up a cow. Innovation number 4. The modern feedlot system. Before the 1950s, raising cattle entirely on grass meant a slow, 4-year cycle before ranchers saw a return on their investment. It also created seasonal supply swings and inconsistent beef quality, as the taste varied depending on what the animal ate. After World War II, a massive surplus of corn and soy changed the landscape. Innovators in the Great Plains realized they could bring high-energy feed directly to the cattle. They developed the total mixed ration, a scientifically formulated nutritional mix designed to maximize growth efficiency. The industry established centralized feedlots, where tens of thousands of cattle spent the final months of their lives eating grain-based diets. This shifted the industry into the grain-finished era. The feedlot system accelerated the transition from ranch to market, dropping the timeline from 3 years to 18 months. This faster turnover allowed the industry to scale significantly. Grain finishing also introduced marbling the intramuscular fat that gives American beef its tender texture and signature flavor profile. Its centralized processing power, establishing highly efficient production corridors across the country. Feedlots solved speed, but they also exposed a blind spot. Pack tens of thousands of cattle into one yard, and you'll see some animals thrive on the same feed that others barely tolerate. Nobody could tell which calf was which until it was already grown. The industry needed to read the animal before it ever set foot in the lot. Innovation number 3. EPDs and genomic testing. For over a century, cattle were evaluated visually. Buyers looked at physical traits like chest, depth, or coat color, but visual assessment was often misleading. High-quality feed could make an average animal look exceptional, and ranchers often had to wait years to see if a bull's offspring actually inherited desirable traits. Starting in the 1970s and accelerating with genomic technology in the 2000s, the industry transitioned from visual appraisal to data science. Breed associations began calculating EPDs, complex mathematical models that isolate an animal's true genetic potential from environmental factors like diet. By the 2010s, ranchers adopted genomic testing. By analyzing a small tissue or hair sample from a newborn calf, labs could read its DNA to predict its growth rate, meat quality, and maternal traits before the animal ever grazed. This data-driven approach allowed ranchers to identify low-performing animals early and focus on high-value traits. It led to a substantial increase in premium-grade beef and turned livestock into a predictable financial asset. Now, ranchers could predict an animal's entire genetic future from a hair sample. But prediction is useless without identity. Across millions of cattle moving through thousands of operations, the industry still had no fast, reliable way to know exactly which animal it was looking at. Innovation number 2. RFID and electronic identification tagging. Historically, cattle identity was managed with hot iron brands or plastic ear tags. But, in a global market, handwritten records and physical tags were prone to error. A single lost tag meant losing all of an animal's health and genetic history. The vulnerabilities of this system became clear in 2003 when the first U.S. case of mad cow disease led to immediate international trade bans, costing the economy billions because the industry could not rapidly trace the animal's history. To solve this, the industry turned to radio frequency identification, or RFID. Small, passive transponders placed in the ear contain a unique 15-digit identification number. Instead of restraining animals to read tags manually, managers use electronic scanners on fences to read the IDs instantly as cattle walk past at normal speeds. This technology enabled highly precise individual management and established the traceability required for modern international exports. It secured biosecurity by allowing rapid traceback of animal movements, keeping global trade lines open and protecting the industry's value. Every animal could now be tracked, traced, and genetically mapped down to the hair follicle. But all of that data still lived inside a fence built the same way it had been built since 1874, with wire, posts, and a lot of manual labor. The last constraint left standing wasn't biological. It was physical. Innovation number 1. Virtual fencing. Since the invention of barbed wire in 1874, the geography of ranching has been largely static. Physical fencing is a major capital expense, costing up to $25,000 per mile to build and maintain. This rigid structure often led to overgrazing, as moving fences to rotate pastures was too labor-intensive. It also made keeping cattle away from sensitive waterways difficult and expensive. Virtual fencing replaces physical wire with GPS-enabled collars and cloud software. Cows wear solar-powered collars that communicate with satellites. Instead of digging post holes, a rancher simply draws a boundary on a digital map. As an animal approaches the virtual line, the collar emits an audible warning beep. If they continue, they receive a mild stimulus. Cattle quickly learn to associate the sound with the boundary and turn back at the beep. Today, these systems can integrate with satellite pasture analysis to automatically adjust boundaries to where the forage is healthiest. This technology brings the industry full circle back to the open range, but with modern control. It enables precise pasture rotation, which improves soil health and allows some ranchers to generate secondary income through carbon credits. It reduces the labor of herding and allows managers to protect ecologically sensitive areas with a click of a mouse. By converting physical barriers into a flexible digital asset, virtual fencing has changed how the land is managed. We are actively removing the very physical wire we started this journey with. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.